Greetings, everyone, and welcome to We Are ACEDS, streaming live on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. My name is Mike Quartararo. I am the president of ACEDS. Today, we're going to be joined shortly by Kassi Burns, a lawyer and technologist whose work in the legal space spans more than 20 years. Kassi writes, she blogs, she has her own podcast called Kassi and usually there's a guest. And she speaks and presents all over the place on legal technology, AI, machine learning, you name it, she's covering it. And somehow she is also a practicing lawyer with King & Spalding. So Kassi is also a great friend of ACEDS. We wanted to have her on to talk about some recent developments in AI governance. So Kassi, thanks for making time to join us today.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate it, Mike. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, no. So as we like to say, let's dance. Let's get into it. For those who don't know, let's start with a little bit about you, your career journey, and how you found your way into this thing we call e-discovery.
Yeah, I think probably like so many people in e-discovery, it's definitely something fell into, didn't go seek out. I graduated law school in 2006 and worked in-house right out of law school, and then found myself in the worst job market ever, at least it felt like at the time, needing something, and I fell into doing doc review. And it was at a really interesting time, I think, in doc review, because that's whenever email threading and tar and things were starting to come into play. So I remember initially reviewing every single document that was imaged from a desktop, right?
That's how you did it in the old days.
Right. Like even cached internet files. It was insane. Okay, we're going to use email threading and we're going to use this new thing called tar, and realizing that understanding that tech process was really important for my career, so I just really made a point of following the technology. So from a discovery contract attorney, became a PM, and then worked on the service provider side, managing a lit support department. That's really where I learned my technical chops, and found myself back doing client delivery stuff, and then found my way to King & Spalding. So, and just really dug into the technology. And I think like so many people, you realize, wow, I understand this logic and I kind of like it. And, it's like hunting for buried treasure. It's a bit of an adrenaline rush sometimes. So,
and I'm not a lawyer, but it's amazing. So like people who are not lawyers have very similar experiences. You just this is all by accident. Like this whole industry just kind of evolved and grew, and people fell into it. So it's a common story. I appreciate you sharing it. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about AI governance guidelines and so forth, and we'll get into that in a second. But let's start with a little context, because I think that's important. How are you defining the class of software tools for legal professionals that sort of fall into this generative AI craze that's going on?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because some people think, well, we've been using AI for a while, or what we've been using hasn't been AI. Why is everyone calling it AI?
Right.
So I think there's a lot of semantics going around, but we have been using machine learning to predict rank. And so there's a level of scoring that happens in that TAR or CAL workflow. But what generative AI does is take it a step further, in that it's actually creating content that we can use beyond just a score or a rank. So if you're using ChatGPT in your free time, what you're doing is you're communicating to it, talking to it in a natural language. You're not having to worry about something like DT search index, and you're telling it what you want, and it's giving that back to you in a format. So in new content, and that content generally for us is going to be text-based, but some of that content could be in the future video-based or audio-based. Audio-based is a great thing, a great example. I'm going to leapfrog a little bit, but there's a great generative AI tool to play around with that's been launched by Google called Notebook LM, and it's available and free to use. And what you do is you upload a single file or multiple files, and it has fixed outputs. So think of like clustering. When you run concept clustered, you're going to get a fixed output, in those tools. So what Notebook LM will do is it will create a table of contents, it will create an executive summary, and it'll even create a podcast for you if you want to get an audio summary of it, maybe while you're driving. So like those kinds of created content outputs. And so what we're seeing in the context of e-discovery is maybe a summary of an individual document. We're still seeing things delivered to us at the document level, which is very, standard for our prior workflows. Or it could be generating a draft priv log entry, or generating, helping to generate chronology. And that's fed by giving it an input. So instead of us saying, here are the DT search syntax that I want to use, it's nearly like your review protocol. You're prompting into that tool to say, this is what's relevant, this is what's going on with the case, these are the key issues. There's more of that. And as attorneys, it fits really well, right? Because language is our thing, right? And also we have the benefit of seeing the document and the output right there to validate. Validation is always going to be important. So that's how it's kind of moved beyond the machine learning tools that we've already had experience with.
And we talk about how these generative AI tools are going to really impact legal, but really I see, think about marketing. It's really going to change how marketing does what they do. I mean, content creation in general. It's fascinating to me. All right. So obviously, we've been in the legal space, both of us, for a long time. And it's clear anybody who works in legal know that they just understand that legal is slow to adopt things. Mm-hmm. And so I always like to ask this question whenever I'm talking to somebody who's in the space, and that is, what do you perceive to be the biggest obstacle to more attorneys adopting these generative AI tools?
I mean, the biggest thing is a legitimate concern is making sure confidentiality and privilege is addressed and taken care of. Because so many of these tools, if you use ChatGPT and you don't change your settings, any of your inputs, anything you upload, anything you ask, that's recursively training that system. It's feeding off of how you're engaging with it to make that LLM better. And because of privilege, confidentiality obligations via our rules of ethics, we have to really think about making sure the tools we're using have sufficient, data flow limitations in place, so we don't run the risk of waiving privilege or letting confidential client information or sensitive client information out the door. So we think it's really understanding those terms and conditions, seeing if your client has, updated guidelines that maybe prohibit the use of it. And even insurance policies may come into play for malpractice coverage. So I think that those are all things that come into play. But I would imagine any sort of savvy legal tech company that is either launching a new tool in their tech stack that's generative AI based, or it's a new disruptive company out there, they realize that's a requirement for their consumer base. So that's the first thing. And then I think the second is AI or tech literacy and competency, because I think that there are many attorneys, we live in our little bubble of e-discovery, and we feel very comfortable jumping around platform to platform. There's still a lot of attorneys that really delegate and push some of those things down. And there's a lot of work that we all have to do to analyze and then bump it back up to maybe a senior partner or a junior partner to get them what they want. And from my perspective, generative AI is different from TAR, where there was the same kind of chatter of TAR is going to take our jobs away. This is different because it's much more ubiquitous. No one else was using TAR in the world like we were, whereas everyone's playing around with ChatGPT. Your grandmother, your kids playing around with it. And what's happening is our business clients are dealing with it on their business side, and that's rolling up to the head of legal, the C-suite, and that's really where that conversation of C-suite client having a conversation with a partner about what are you doing with AI. And so I think that's really driving things and getting more attention at a much larger spectrum of attorneys than before. So I think there's going to be a tech knowledge gap that has to be filled, because some attorneys maybe felt like, I don't need to deal with that. But there's just going to be the ability, if used correctly, to analyze data so much more effectively, always with a human in the loop, maybe create methods of strategy that over time, if attorneys aren't using it, they could potentially be putting themselves, at a strategic disadvantage, just because time is a resource that we can't add to. Time is fixed. So if we can do anything to give us more time, I think that's really important.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. All right, let's get into a little bit about the primary reason we are here today. So the ABA published last summer their formal opinion 512, which provides some guidance to attorneys on their ethical obligations when using generative AI tools. In summary form, what are a couple of the takeaways from that opinion that you believe practitioners need to know about?
Well, I think going on, competency, this is something that we've all been talking about as a segue to what we were just talking about, really does lean into the idea of technical competency. Now, it doesn't mean that everyone in your law firm needs to know everything about LLMs, but I think it really is a bit of the canary in the coal mine of really needing to understand these technologies, because it's become very apparent by cases that have arisen and come up with sanctions that some attorneys don't understand it. And if you use these tools, you need to understand how to use it. Maybe you pull in a technical resource to help provide guidance. But there is an acknowledgement of there's going to be a place for these tools in our profession. Though, care has to be taken, again, to protect confidentiality, to protect privilege. I think it does a really good job of talking about duty of transparency and what you need to inform your client about. And there's an acknowledgement of, you don't have to tell your client every time you use AI or generative AI. It's really when it's important to how it's being used is maybe determinative or very heavily keyed into an outcome, or it's something that the client might want to use. So as you know, Mike, it's not like everything is either all analog or all a GPT output, right? It is going to increasingly become a hybrid output where we're using these tools like we've already been using for a while, whether it's with Westlaw or LexisNexis and their AI tools, or Relativity or Reveal. It's really at the core of it. Attorneys still have the obligation to have legal technical competency. We still have an obligation to supervise. And those attorneys out there that weren't doing it, maybe they weren't doing it before, and it was the hallucinated case that made it apparent to everyone, okay, this attorney didn't even try to read this case that they're citing in their case law. So some other points of guidelines that I thought were interesting is, talking about the validation, the supervision of not only your attorneys, but also, the technologies that you're using. And that falls into the human in the loop conversation that we often have. And it talks about maybe a spectrum of how much scrutiny a tool needs to be given. And if it's something that's created for or built for the legal tech world that's been, maybe more broadly validated by the profession, there may be a sliding scale of how much intense scrutiny it might need for, the general use beyond your own validation that the specific outputs are correct. So
yeah, I think that's incredibly valuable. And what I tell anybody using these tools is just double check everything. Particularly if you're asking for legal precedent, like we've seen the stories, the horror stories. It can hallucinate. So be careful.
And it does so very convincingly,
Yes.
it rolls out there very confidently
Yes.
with what it's saying.
It has a technological arrogance that I've not seen before.
Yeah. Exactly.
The other big development was just last month. A bipartisan House task force on artificial intelligence published this massive, nearly 300-page report that I'm sure nobody wants to read, but we asked you to take a look at it, and it's got a broad range of findings and recommendations. What are the most significant findings and recommendations the House report makes that you think our listeners should know about?
I really think this goes into a bigger topic of you can't follow all of the AI news. It's
impossible.
Literally impossible. There's just so much. I mean, just this week alone, we've had state AG drop guidance. We've had multiple executive orders. We've had guidelines and strategy from USPTO, just ongoing. I think you have to pick your poison. You have to know what's going to be most important to you. Maybe it's the sector that your client is focused on, or maybe it's a specific aspect, maybe it's intellectual property or data and privacy, and really try to focus on those things. And what's, I think, great about this report, which there's nothing binding in it, it's more of a framework or guidelines for future policymakers, considerations to keep in mind. But for those of us practitioners, it gives us a good, I think, easy button to look and see, like, what are some of the issues around AI, policy issues around healthcare or financial services. So the document, to your point, it's huge. It's 250 plus pages, but it's broken down into topic/sector. And they do a really good job of, at the very beginning of this report, they include key findings and recommendations for each of those categories of focus. And at the very beginning of the report, they have them all there together for you, nice little roadmap. And then what you can do, if you decide data privacy is important to me, I really want to kind of focus on that. I have a lot of clients in healthcare and finance, and I'm kind of interested in what it's saying about energy, because obviously energy has a huge impact on the use of these tools. Then you can go and drill into those specific sections and see where they're going into things in more detail. Again, what you could do is load it into Notebook LM and maybe listen to it, as a podcast, knowing that it may not all be accurate, but it may, like, as far as, I just want the high points.
Right.
Is this worth me drilling into later? I have a 20-minute commute or a 10-minute commute. This might give me something to look into. I think those kinds of tools are great at giving guideposts and flagging up, hey, maybe I need to drill into this document a little bit more. So I think, at a very high level, that's relevant. Now, it does have a section about energy and the data grid. And I think that's really relevant to raise here. I am in Texas, energy, oil and gas, it's a very big thing. And I actually, on my podcast, today's episode, had a guest that is in the renewable energy sector, and he's general counsel for a renewable energy company. And, that's an interesting interplay, because one criticism of these new AI tools is the burden it places on the data grid, on the energy sector, because it takes so much power. And so, maybe how you combat that is try to leverage renewable energy sources where possible. But not only did that podcast episode get published this morning, but more importantly, there was an executive order that came out yesterday, that was published yesterday, specifically about AI and our infrastructure. And it talks about the need for investment in data grids, in data centers, making sure our energy grid doesn't get overburdened, because we are probably going to rely on these tools more and more. And that's something important to think about, as practitioners of, if you play around with ChatGPT, there are different GPT models you can use. There's a drop-down menu. You can use the most recent one. You can use an older one. And it's something to think about. The fancier, faster, more powerful one is going to take more energy. If what you're wanting to use that tool for is a lower lift, maybe select one of the older ones, and you would maybe get 90% of what you are aiming for, because it's not anything complex. You're not wanting like advanced reasoning type of dialogue. And that way you as a user are doing your part to minimize that energy, burden on our bigger infrastructure. So yeah, lots of interest.
I think nobody really thinks like we all think about technology as, I just turn on my computer and use it, right? And then nobody really thinks about the impact on the environment, on the power grid. It's substantial.
Yeah.
So thanks for sharing that.
And I think that we're seeing that as these tools start becoming more available in e-discovery and legal tech, that pricing model is different from what we've experienced or what we've initially seen, right? Some of the pricing model might be, token based. So generally, like all of these LLMs have a token based type of pricing model. If you go beyond, your flat, I have a plus subscription to ChatGPT, right? If you use the API, you in essence are paying for X number of tokens. And once your ask to the LLM uses up those tokens, you're going to have to pay for more. And it's not unlike back in the olden days, whenever we had to pay for individual text messages. Do you remember that, Mike?
I do remember paying, because I didn't do it. I just didn't pay for it. I just said, you know what? I'm not texting.
Right. So there was a time when we had to pay, a per item charge for things. We're seeing that now because the technology is new. Hopefully there'll be innovation. There's a lot of conversation about, we maxed out these LLMs because like the data that's available for it to train on, we're kind of hitting a plateau because we're not able to recreate all the data that's already been there, that we've created over a 20-year period. But maybe innovation will come in having more efficient LLMs that are not as burdensome. So
very, very specifically focused LLMs that deal with a particular thing: legal, energy, market.
Right.
Yeah,
Right. Exactly.
I could see that coming as well. All right, we're almost out of time. Before we go, one point I wanted to make was up on today's on the ACEDS blog today is Kassi's post about these two reports. One report, one opinion from the ABA. So go check out aceds.org, the blog, for a little bit more detail. And Kassi, my last question for you is what's new and interesting coming up in your life? Any conferences or anything like that you're excited about?
Yeah, so I'm leaving later this afternoon for the Sedona Conference's inaugural meeting for Working Group 13, AI in the Law. And it's my first Sedona event to go to, so I figured might as well make it AI. So I'll be flying to Phoenix for that. Really excited to see what that a goose group of people will have to say. I also will be at Academy of Court Appointed Neutrals. As you had Meryl Hirsch and I on to talk about ACAN, which often, discovery professionals are court appointed neutrals or special masters. And we'll have our annual meeting in March, and I will have a panel on AI and access to justice that I'm very excited about. Because that is the potential benefit to AI is it some of the technologies that maybe have been around for 5 years are becoming more cost effective, not as expensive. And so how can we leverage these technologies to assist a burdened court system and docket? So I think those are all really important things to be thinking about. So that's where I am. I have some writing that I have, I do like to write quite a bit. But I'm really trying to find a little bit of balance this year, Mike, because hypervigilance and hyperfatigue is real and you can't do it all. So that's really what I'm trying to come to terms with.
Well, this has been great. Thanks so much for joining us today. I appreciate your energy and vigilance. It's amazing and a service to everybody in the community, frankly. Okay, folks, if you are interested in our short form video interviews like this one, you can find our live streams on LinkedIn, Twitter, or X, as they say now, Facebook, or you can check out the ACEDS YouTube channel where you can watch previous interviews. As always, thanks for joining us today. And as I always say, be kind to one another.